Seb's Soapbox. Last week, I talked about the dangers of dehumanizing those guilty of inhuman thought and action. And this week, I want to talk about how the sanctification of champions of our side is equally dangerous. Especially in this country where we have this thing that Robert Bellah, sociologist, called American civil religion. And where those faithful to this creed often put current and former elected officials upon more than human pedestals. Just think of the Founding Fathers or Abraham Lincoln or the office of the presidency, that in and of itself is a thing that is invested with an almost supernatural veneration. And venerating leaders in this way also blinds us, just as much as demonizing the opposition does. Nobody is ultimately more than human, and nobody is less than human. All people are people, but nobody is more than human, whether their name is Lincoln or Obama or Reagan or Trump. American politics, however, is very inviting for these dynamics, since there is this two-party system that invites a form of black and white thinking where those on our team are elevated beyond mere humanity, while those on the other team are essentially painted as disgusting, barely human monstrosities that eat babies or worse. And this is true of both parties and their fans, and that in itself is a huge problem, because nobody should ever be a fan of a politician. Nobody should be a fan of a political party. Politicians are not your friends. I do repeat, do not, absolutely not engage in a parasocial relationship with any politician. That's a very, very bad idea that just leads to the worst kinds of politics that a person can have. But this kind of thought is ultimately deeply ingrained in American tradition and therefore in the American psyche. Since the United States lacked royalty and inherited titles, that void apparently needed to be filled by venerating elected office holders. And most nation-states in the world have national heroic figures that represent the aspirations and ideals that the nation officially strives towards. And in many cases, these figures are former heads of state or part of the founding generation of the nation, people who managed to bring their country through difficult times. But only very few industrialized nation-states have elevated their elected officials to the heights that the United States of America has done with its own past and present leaders. The United States has amassed quite the pantheon of sacred secular figures that represent the nation-state. First, of course, there are the mythical founding fathers, and then there are later presidents like Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and John F. Kennedy, and Ronald Reagan, who all offer benevolent guidance from above, informing the nation's mythological self-perception as a secular sacred project. And the state that we here in hell live in, Illinois, proudly bears Land of Lincoln on every license plate. So it is hardly surprising that one can barely walk a block through Springfield, the state capital, without bumping into some historical marker, building, museum, or plaque that in some way memorializes Honest Abe, his life and his time and what he did, where he ate, where he slept, where he took a dump. It's ridiculous. But Lincoln himself and his place in the pantheon of the American civil religion is somewhat peculiar, because ultimately here's a president who presided over the nation's worst and most destructive war to date, and an internal war no less. He also oversaw the nation's largest mass execution during the Dakota Wars of 1862, but that's not really something that anybody ever learns in school here. And he also carries the title of Great Emancipator because he ended chattel slavery, which was a system that the American economy had been based upon until the end of the Civil War. And no fewer than 3 states before, if Washington, D.C. was added, have a claim to him and his life. Lincoln was born in Kentucky. He started out as a lawyer in Indiana, and then he rose to fame and political power in Illinois, and then finally spent 8 years as the final 8 years of his life in the nation's capital. The Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum in Springfield celebrates this elected official in many ways, that in some cases exhibit questionable taste, and in other cases just veer into pure hagiography. It is both a temple for Abraham Lincoln, and also a Lincoln amusement park. The techniques that are used in the main exhibition to keep the visitor's attention are surely inventive, expensive, and glossy, but the exhibition is, however, quite light on artifacts, on actual artifacts, and rich in just multimedia blitz. The exhibition is also rich in pathos and just brimming with patriotic national pride. The elevation of a figure like Lincoln to such heights is surely understandable, but does not allow much room for any kind of interrogation and interpretation. And the same is true for most of America's other secular saints. To question them, to interrogate their motives and how they lived up to the ideals they supposedly stand for, is for many Americans tantamount to heresy. And this, for any society, is a dangerous social mechanic. An open society must be able to question their past and present heroes' goodness and integrity. The past is never dead. The past is never resting, and it is always in motion through interpretation, reinterpretation, and shifts in social and political paradigms. And the dangers of blindly elevating a Lincoln to these heights are illustrated in the way that the people on the other side of the Civil War are celebrated today, up until today in the South. Because here we have military men and, again, elected public officials like Jefferson Davis, who, although they represent a thoroughly defeated and generally accepted as pretty despicable past, are lifted up to the same status of secular sainthood as Lincoln is in Springfield, in Illinois, or rather in the rest of the nation, I guess. Criticism of the validity of monuments like these is often brushed aside because the position that these figures metaphorically and physically inhabit is, in the Southern mindset, seen as equally sacrosanct and unquestionable, and to act against this status is again tantamount to secular sacred heresy. But those are easy examples. The harder ones are the public secular saints who are, on closer inspection, neither all good nor all bad. George Washington, the nation's mythical founding father who could never tell a lie, had dentures made from slave teeth, among other things. And he also claimed ownership of a substantial amount of human beings of African descent, which is also true for Thomas Jefferson, who also sired, on top of that, several children with underage slave mistress Sally Hemings. But to shine a light on these less than savory aspects of the lives and deeds of these mythical figures means walking on thin ice. To insult the Founding Fathers by claiming them to be less than pure is to insult the nation itself. The whole process also leads to a split between the actual persons and the mythical personas they inhabit. But interrogating the person behind the persona is again something that is often seen as tantamount to heresy, since this split is often obscured and not everyone adhering to civil religion is even aware that the split exists. And the danger here is the development of blind spot in our national pasts, because the higher a public figure is lifted towards something resembling sainthood, the worse this blind spot ultimately gets. In the worst case scenario, such a blind spot can obfuscate any and all bad deeds a nation was ever involved in. And that leads to the creation of legends that must not be questioned, and anybody who does question those legends ends up being branded a traitor to the body politic. This is a trend in today's America, and how public discourse about the American military is handled, for example. The troops increasingly become uncoupled from the actual people who make up the military, while the military becomes a pars pro toto stand-in for the nation itself. And to question the troops is heresy, is treasonous and un-American. And that is a mechanic that often serves to deliberately or not erase the existence and the lives of veterans who are oftentimes abandoned by the military after their terms of service, their tours of duty have ended. And also, of course, as somebody who grew up in West Germany, this lionization of the military and public figures, I of course cannot help but react with apprehension, because modern Germany does not have any parallels to this. There are no temple-like memorials to past elected officials or military leaders. The troops, well, the Bundeswehr, the German army, is generally not seen as the champions of the nation. However, they strive towards an ideal of citizens in uniform. Just people like you and me. They're just wearing a uniform, and that's who they are. All throughout the ranks. And our leaders, German leaders, past and present, lack a patina of sainthood. And, well, people who want to imbue German leaders with the patina of sainthood, you can imagine who they want to imbue with that kind of patina, so I'll let you do the math. And sure, there still are today monuments in Germany of people like Bismarck, and monuments to past kings and queens and all kinds of old nobility. But those are understood differently than monuments of American leaders are usually. Because it would not create any kind of public outrage these days if someone publicly criticized Bismarck these days. And it's quite clearly understood in discourse in Germany that the public figures of old are part of history, and that while we still keep up monuments and memorials to long-dead feudal lords, these are not there to venerate and honor these people, but to remind the current population of its own history, of both the good and the bad. Granted, there are no monuments or figures to Hitler or any of the Nazi regime to remind people of that, because that's a difficult story. And also, the memorials that are there were not put up long after the fact, and about a resurging white supremacist anger over black people existing, like so many of the awful Confederate memorials in the South were. Unreflectively venerating past leaders also blinds us to the flaws of our current leaders. In the United States, the office of the president, as I said, comes with this patina of secular sainthood. Sure, any given president had political opposition, but especially those presidents who are recently deceased join the founding fathers in the pantheon of American civil religion. Just look at the way that Ronald Reagan is talked about in the current in current discourse. And to remind people that he was quite the controversial figure who, for example, can be squarely blamed for ignoring the AIDS crisis and worsening the AIDS crisis, more or less deliberately, due to his victims being overwhelmingly homosexual. Well, if you mention that is overwhelmingly seen as a left-wing smear campaign against the man who brought America out of the malaise of the 1970s and who defeated communism. Or how the media is churning out praise for someone as awful as George H.W. Bush, who was a former head of the CIA, who was a Texas oil man, and just all around not a very pleasant human being. But saying anything like that about a former president will get you yelled at, even by ostensibly capital D Democratic voters. Even if you criticize people who only ran for the presidency and didn't really do much good for the country as a whole, other than getting shot down during a war where they were ostensibly on the wrong side of, like John McCain, who, by the way, played no small role in getting America's political landscape into the bat crap, rabbit frothing at the mouth shape it is in today by having that running mate, which we probably all have already memory hold. Even talking bad about someone like that, or about another living, awful person like George W. Bush, George Bush Jr., will get you tutted at as lacking decorum. Again, by Democratic voters. I don't have to tell you what happens when you so much as disagree only once, that any Democratic person was a completely pure paragon president. Turning public elected officials into saints has the benefit of presenting the nation with easily understood aspirational ideals, of course. But if the price for these ideals is the complete loss of nuance and a muzzling of voices trying to investigate the validity of these ideals and figures, we as a society should just understand that we have to steer clear of this practice. I like to half-jokingly say that every single American president is a war criminal. Yes, that one too. And also that one. And especially that one. And, yes, that usually doesn't get me many friends. But it's not like I care. But I will admit that such polemic isn't necessarily helpful, as cathartic as it may be. And due to this being a polemic, it also lacks nuance. However, historians like me and people who have an awareness for how the world works have a special duty here to not back down in the face of opposition and cries of treason and heresy when we uncover and investigate difficult pasts of popular public figures, living or dead. This might be a harder line to walk than appeasing those voices wanting their secular saints unblemished, but as custodians of the past, we must always strive to see the full picture, no matter if someone's national pride might get hurt by what we have to say. Unchecked national pride and civil religion that is unmoored from historical and factual reality only gives fodder and fertile soil to demagoguery and a kind of nationalism that this country defeated and my country in the past. And this is a lesson we must never forget. No matter how uplifting and entertaining a glitzy multimedia temple to living or dead elected officials may be. I'm Seb, and now I'm getting back down from my soapbox. Thanks for listening.